Hi, welcome. I'm Andrew Strome, and thank you for joining us. Today I'm going to show you how to make a simple dovetailed box out of quarter sawn walnut. It's a very approachable beginner's project, and it makes a great gift. I have my pre-dimensioned stock, a marking gauge, a ruler, dovetail marker, a small square, a marking knife, a fine dovetail saw. This one happens to have 20 teeth per inch. A coping saw, 3 sizes of bevel edge chisel, 3/4, 1/2 inch, and 1/4 inch, a rabbiting block plane, a small bevel up smoothing plane, a mallet, and a hammer. We're going to make a box with through dovetail joints at all 4 corners. The first step, what I've done is I've taken all my pieces and I've oriented them as they're going to be in the finished box, primarily with some grain considerations in mind. So I'm using walnut that's got a little bit of sapwood and a little bit of heartwood, so there's a nice contrast between them. I'm putting the heartwood, the darker part, at the bottom of the box just to give it a little bit of visual weight. So I've laid the pieces out to my pleasing, and I've numbered all 4 corners, so 1, 2, 3, 4, so that I can keep track of the joints as I cut them. So the first step when dovetailing a box is to take your marking gauge, and I'm going to set it to just very slightly less than the thickness of my material. And what that will do is it will cause the end grain surfaces of the joint to be a little bit recessed. When I clean off those surfaces, I'll remove all the layout marks and damage that might have been caused in the process of making it. I'm going to put the tails of the joint on the 2 ends of the box. So the next step is actually to lay out the spacing of those tails. I could space them equally across the width of the box, but in this case what I'm going to do is I'm going to space them unequally, and that'll give it a little bit of visual interest. So I've got this one, this corner laid out already, and I've got 1, 2, 3, 4 tails going across, and then the spaces between the tails are called pins, and so I've got 3 full pins here, and then a 1/2 pin on each edge of the joint. So I have my ruler along the baseline that I described with my marking gauge. My stock is 4 inches wide, so I'm just going to make a pencil mark at the 2-inch point. I could measure this, but the easier way is for me to simply take the chisel that I'm going to use to cut the joint and to put a pencil mark on either side of the blade. And then I'm going to take my dovetail marker and use it to scribe those angled lines, and that gives me a pin in the middle of the joint. Now that I've laid out the location of the center pin, I'm going to come to the outside edges of the joint, and I'm going to come in about 1/8 of an inch, which is half the width of my chisel. And then I'm going to take my dovetail marker. There we go. What I've got here are 2 large tails. I could make them equal, but I'm going to make a narrower one on the outside and wider ones towards the center of the joint. And what it'll do is it'll create a nice pattern on the end grain of the joint when I put the box together. So I'm going to make the 2 outside tails about 5/8 of an inch wide. And so now we've got 2 tails on the outside of the joint, and we can use our chisel again, placing it on the baseline. And now I've laid out the 2 pins on the outside of the joint. Take my marker, and there's my completed layout. So now that I have a corner laid out, I can use this as a template to mark the remaining corners. Because the joint is symmetrical, I can simply butt the pieces up against each other like this, make a pencil mark at the location of each tail, and then use my dovetail marker to strike a line down in the appropriate direction. The next step is to take my workpiece and clamp it vertically in my vise. And I'm going to use my square to square across where each layout mark is so that I've delineated where my tails are on the end grain surface of this piece. And now it's time to start cutting. My feet are about a shoulder's width apart, and I'm standing at a little bit of an angle to the work. I'm using a triangulated grip, so I've got my index finger extended along the spine of the saw. I'm going to start at the back and drop the saw down like this. Notice I'm already holding the saw at that rake angle for the dovetail. And then it's just a matter of cutting down as evenly as possible and letting the saw do the work. Now, my elbow all the way through my forearm, all the way out to the spine of the saw, those are all in alignment. Think piston. So the idea is to go back and forth as smoothly and evenly as possible. One of the challenges sometimes people have when they're sawing is cutting at a 90-degree angle to the face of the work. And that usually is a result of the position of your elbow. And so if I push my elbow, I'm just going to push it out a little bit from my body. It's exaggerated, but can you see how the saw is now angled this way? And conversely, if I bring it in, it's more square to the work. So if you're having a hard time, if you're having difficulty cutting at a 90-degree angle to the face of the work when you're cutting joinery, usually it's a result of the position of your elbow relative to your torso. As I'm finishing my saw cuts, I'm doing my best to keep the tooth line of the saw level so that I'm not overcutting the joint on one side or the other. I could chisel all this waste out, but I'm going to use a coping saw to expedite the process. So I'm going to start with the saw about 3/4 of the way down in my kerf. I'm going to get the saw going, and I'm just going to twist my wrist so that the coping saw blade turns that corner. Now that I've used my dovetail saw to make the cuts for the tails and removed the bulk of the waste with the coping saw, where the pins of the joint are going to be, I need to remove the waste material on the outside edges where the half pins are going to be. And I'm going to use my marking knife and my square, and I'm just going to incise a line very sharply right where that shoulder is going to be. So this is an important cut. I need to get it square to the face of the work and also square to the edge. This is what's called a first-class cut. It shows. So I've scored a knife line here, and then I'm going to take a chisel, and I'm just going to use the corner of the chisel, removing a little notch. So what it's doing is I'm cutting a V-shaped trench for my saw to sit in when I start that cut, because the saw is going to follow the path of least resistance. And so now I'm going to repeat that for the remaining edge cuts. So the next step is going to be using the chisel to remove the waste in the recesses between the tails. To ensure that I have a nice flat registration surface, I can just use my little square and come in and test that surface to make sure there are no gaps along the base of that joint. I'm going to use these as templates for laying out the pins. So I've got one of my pin boards clamped vertically in the vise. I've brought this piece that's going to mate to it on top of it. And so I'm just using my fingertips to ensure that I've got proper alignment side to side, and I can check with my fingers on the end grain to ensure that they're aligned front to back. And I'm going to take my marking knife. I am ensuring that I'm keeping my knife tight up against the tails and transferring the location of the dovetails to the piece that's going to fit into it. Give myself some pencil tick marks where those knife lines are. Come in with my square and give myself some lines to saw to. So now I'm going to take my pins board, clamp it vertically in the vise. And it's worth putting a little square on here just to double check and make sure that I'm close to vertical. So it's this series of cuts that's going to determine how well my joint fits. So what I have to remember is that each of these knife lines has a waist side. So the waist side is to the inside of the joint. I need to cut right up to each knife line, but not beyond it. So on my first cut, the waist is to the right hand side of the line. And then on the second cut, it's to the left, and they alternate going across the joint. So what I like to do is make all the cuts in one direction at the same time, and then come back the other way. Put the saw so that the edge of the teeth are just touching the knife line. And I've got the saw angled at the correct angle. I can sight along the tooth line and see that it's angled correctly. So I've started at the back, and I'm just going to drop the saw down and make a vertical cut. And that's why I prefer to cut the pins as the second cut, because I find this vertical cut is much easier to make than to make a raking cut as my second cut. So. To remove this waist, it's the same trick with the coping saw. Start about 3/4 of the way down. And then I need to finish my cut at an angle. If I cut straight, I'm going to cut into my pin. So now that I've finished removing the waist, I'll take this out, and I'll just show you how the joint is going to go together. It's a little on the tight side, but I can just press it together. I still have some waist to remove with the chisel down to the baseline there, but you can see that it's going to fit together nicely, and the contrasting pattern created by the end grain on the end pieces of the box. Take this apart, use a chisel to chisel back to the baselines. I can't chisel straight down adjacent to the saw cuts, of course, because the pin tapers away towards the bottom. So if I chisel straight down, I'm actually going to cut in to the surface of my joint. So what I need to do is start vertically and then angle the chisel right after the first cut. And then just like that, going halfway through. And this opening happens to be a little bit wider than my chisel, so I'm just going to gently tap to remove the rest of that waste. And then I'm going to continue with the remainder of these recesses. This is a show surface here, so if I twist the chisel at all, I'm going to wind up with a gap in the finished joint. What I have to do is finish cutting on the other side, and then I'm going to clamp this piece vertically in the vise, and there's going to be probably a high spot in the middle, and I need to remove that in order for the joint to seat. So if I run my fingers along the end grain surfaces here, I can feel that there is a high spot where those two chisel cuts that I made intersect. So I'm going to take a narrow chisel and remove the high point on the end grain of this piece. So that's a registration surface, and that high spot will keep the joint from seating completely. So I'm just making very light sweeping cuts with a narrow chisel to remove that. I've cut just shy of the baseline on this recess. It's going to be difficult to remove by chopping. It's just a tiny little bit of waste. So I'm going to pare that away vertically. Now we're going to test it for fit. There we go. So now I just have to repeat that 3 more times for the remaining corners. So I've done a dry run of the assembly. I've double checked the joints to make sure that they seat properly. And I've used a square in the corners to ensure that the box will glue up squarely, and it does. So the next step is for me to remove the box from the clamps, disassemble it, apply the glue, and glue it up for good. As you'll recall from earlier, I've actually numbered all the corner joints so that they go back together in the right order. For the first part of my glue up, clamp the pin boards vertically, and I'm going to size the end grain here. So I'm using a water-based glue, and what sizing will do is the end grain will tend to soak up a lot of the water in the glue, and that can lead to what's called a starved joint, which is when the glue doesn't cure properly. So sizing the joint, basically I apply a thin layer of glue that seals the end grain surface, and then I'm going to make a second application of glue that will cause the joint to be held much more durably. It really doesn't take very much glue, you're just sealing the end grain surfaces at this point. Reapply the glue to the end grain surfaces, but then I'm also going to glue the long grain surfaces as well. And I'm just going to use a wooden spreader here. And of course it has the mechanical lock provided by the taper. So it really doesn't require a lot of glue. And then I'm just going to apply a little bit of glue to these surfaces as well. Bring the end up to it and drive it home. It will actually cause that glue to be pushed down and into the joint. So here we go. You'll see everything going together without any difficulty, and that comes from paying attention and being careful with all the little steps that lead up to this moment. Now what I'm going to do is set my clamps back up. So what I'm being careful to do as well is apply even pressure with the clamps. I'm actually checking for square, and I can see that I have a gap right here. So what I'm going to do is put a clamp across the diagonal and apply some force with the clamp, and that will bring the corners into square. So I'm going to put this aside for about an hour while the glue sets, but then I can get to work on the bottom. So the bottom is simply going to be nailed to the box itself. I've got some really nice stock here. It's quarter sawn material, so it's going to be very dimensionally stable, so I'm not going to run into any issues of wood movement. There's about 1/8 of an inch reveal around the edges of the box, but to soften that up, I'm just going to cut a very shallow bevel just to make it a little lighter visually. So the first thing to do is for me to lay that out. I'm going to set my marking gauge here to a little bit less than 1/8, about 1/16 of an inch or so. Scribe all the way around. I can lay out the depth of the bevel. If I was to go with the same setting, I'd wind up with 45 degrees, but I think I want a little bit steeper bevel. So I'm just going to change this and make it a little bit deeper just to make the whole thing a little lighter visually. So I've reset my gauge to a little bit more than 1/8 of an inch. And now I'm going to scribe along the grain and across the end grain. And those scribe lines will show me where to stop. So I'm getting ready to plane those chamfers. I've got my workpiece overhanging the bench a little bit. Because I'm dealing with a softer wood here, I'm just going to protect it a little bit. This is a low angle smoothing plane. Could use a small block plane. Any small scale plane that's going to be appropriate to the size of the work will do a good job of this. I'm planing the end grain first because as you plane across the grain, you're going to get a little bit of tear out, which is actually technically called spelching. So spelch is it's a good Scrabble word. I'm cutting across the grain first. I'm going to do both ends, and then I'm going to plane the long grain edges. I'm coming in with the plane, and you can see that I'm holding it at a compound angle so that I'm taking a shearing cut. So I'm skewing the plane, and that's going to give me a nice finish even on the end grain. So now I'm going to turn it around and do the other end. One of the ways that I can tell that my plane cuts along the grain wound up in the right place is that I've got a nice even corner right here. So I've beveled the edges. Next thing for me to do is lay out and drill some pilot holes for the nails that are going to attach the bottom to the box. So I'm going to flip it over. One of the ways to help the nails hold better is on the ends of the box. I'm going to put two nails, but I'm going to angle them inwards. And in that taper, like the taper of a dovetail, is going to counteract the force of the weight of anything that happens to be in the box and help keep the bottom attached securely. So the first thing to do, though, is for me to lay out the center line of where those holes are going to be. So I've said there's 1/8 of an inch reveal. My stock is 3/8 of an inch thick. Half of 3/8 is 3/16 plus my reveal. That gives me 5/16. So I have to come in 5/16 of an inch from the outside edges of my bottom. So I'm just going to set my square to 5/16 of an inch. I'm going to use a pencil line for this because it doesn't have to be exceptionally precise, and I want to be able to erase it afterwards. And then I'll probably put 3 nails along the edges. I've laid out some positions 5/16 in from the edge of my bottom. Now I'm just going to lay out the center locations of my pilot holes, and I'm coming in about 1 inch. For the center hole along the ends, I can just drill straight down. And then I mentioned the outside holes are going to be angled to hold the bottom securely. And then I'm actually going to do the same thing with the holes along the front and back of the box. And there we go. Got my pilot holes drilled. So now I'm going to take the box out of the clamps. So the glue here has set. You can see there are just a few small beads. So that's about the right amount of squeeze out that you want. You don't want glue oozing all over the place because at this stage, I'm going to clean up the outside surfaces of the box with a plane, and the less glue there is, the neater the whole process will be. Here's how it's going to go together in its finished state. But the next step is for me to clean up these outside surfaces of the box. So I've clamped the box in the vise. I'm paying attention to the direction of the grain. I'm left-handed, so I'm going to be planing in this direction. The grain is coming up this way, so that I'm going to get a cleaner cut with the plane that way. So I've got it clamped, and I'm going to take a couple of test cuts and adjust the plane as I go. I'm just going to focus on cleaning up the joints, each joint one at a time, and then I'm going to turn it over. What I'm doing is I'm making sure I level every surface where a joint is with the plane. So now that I've got the joints leveled off, I'm just going to go around with my fingertips and double check and see, especially on the bottom, if there's any offset in the joints. There's a little one right there that's going to keep the box from sitting flat on the base. So I'm just going to plane that off quickly, and then we can get to attaching the base. Pivoting the plane through the corners to ensure that everything's nice and level. Make sure that it's sitting flat. I'm going to pivot it, and it doesn't rock, so that's a good sign. So what I can do now is flip it over and clamp it and nail the bottom in place. I'm going to use headless brads to secure the bottom. You can see that they are tapered to a point, so they're wedge shaped. It's important that I orient them the correct way relative to the direction of the grain. If I orient them so that the wedge is at 90 degrees to the grain, they will actually serve to potentially split the wood in the bottom. So I need to orient the brads so that the taper is parallel to the direction of the grain. All right, so now that the nails securing the bottom are installed, I can remove the clamps and turn the box over. Voila. Our box is completed. If you want to take the project a little bit further, you can add a lid to it. The lid doesn't have to be anything fancy. It can be a slab of wood that matches the bottom. You can attach the lid using some butt hinges or some simple surface mount hinges. Or if you wish, a nice touch is to rabbet the underside of the lid, so an L-shaped cutout all around the perimeter, and just to have the lid press fit nicely into position. If you wish, you can also add a handle just to give something to pull on when you're removing it. As far as finishes for this type of box go, the simpler the better. So a wash coat of shellac, a little bit of a coating of a beeswax polish, maybe a light oil finish. Those would all be appropriate and easy to apply for a simple project like this. And so there you have it, the completed project. Thanks very much for joining us, and we'll see you next time.